The Blackwood Manor stood atop the hill like a sentinel, its stone facade weathered by a century of New England winters. As Thomas Harrington's carriage approached the estate in the autumn of 1912, he couldn't help but notice how the afternoon light cast long shadows across the property. The recent death of his uncle, Edmund Blackwood, had summoned him from Boston to this remote corner of Massachusetts. "We've arrived, sir," the driver announced, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. Thomas adjusted his spectacles and gathered his belongings. At 32, he'd established himself as a respectable accountant in Boston, far removed from his family's old money and the crumbling estate before him. He had not visited Blackwood Manor since childhood, and the memories were hazy at best. The estate's solicitor, Mr. Graves, awaited him at the entrance, clutching his hat against the wind. "Mr. Harrington, welcome to Blackwood Manor. I trust your journey was comfortable?" "As comfortable as one might expect," Thomas replied, surveying the grounds. The gardens had fallen into disrepair, with weeds strangling what once must have been immaculate flower beds. "The staff has been reduced to a skeleton crew since your uncle's passing," Mr. Graves explained, noting Thomas's gaze. "Only Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, Edwin, the groundskeeper, and Margaret, the maid, remain." As they entered the foyer, Thomas was struck by the oppressive silence of the house. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that managed to penetrate the heavy drapes. The air smelled of wood polish and something else, something older and more pervasive. "Your uncle's will is quite straightforward, Mr. Graves continued as they settled in the study. "As his only living relative, you inherit the estate and all its holdings, contingent upon your residence here for a minimum of 3 months. 3 months? Thomas frowned. "That wasn't mentioned in your letter. A peculiarity of your uncle's, I'm afraid. He was most insistent that the heir should experience the house before claiming ownership." A soft knock interrupted them. The door opened to reveal a young woman in a maid's uniform, her features delicate yet somehow difficult to focus on, as if she existed slightly out of alignment with her surroundings. "Pardon the interruption," she said, her voice surprisingly melodious. "I've prepared tea in the drawing room." "Ah, you must be Margaret," Thomas said, rising to his feet. A flicker of something, confusion, amusement, crossed her face before settling into a polite smile. "Yes, sir. Margaret." As she turned to leave, Thomas noticed a peculiar detail. While her uniform was impeccably pressed, the hem was stained with what appeared to be dark soil. "Mrs. Collins has prepared the master bedroom for you," Mr. Graves said, drawing Thomas's attention back. "All of your uncle's papers are in the study. He kept meticulous records." Later that evening, after Mr. Graves had departed, Thomas found himself alone in the cavernous dining room, picking at his dinner. Mrs. Collins, a stern woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features, had served him silently before disappearing into the kitchen. Thomas was about to retire when he noticed a photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a group of people standing before the manor, his uncle, younger and less severe, Mrs. Collins, recognizable despite the decades, Edwin, already stooped with age, and, standing slightly apart from the others, a maid who bore a striking resemblance to Margaret. The photograph was dated 1882. A chill that had nothing to do with the draughty room crept up Thomas's spine. He took the photograph with him as he ascended the creaking staircase to his bedroom, unable to shake the feeling that someone was watching him from the shadows. That night, Thomas dreamed of corridors that stretched and contracted, of whispered conversations behind closed doors, and of a young woman with soil-stained hems who smiled at him with too many teeth. Morning arrived with a persistent fog that clung to the windows, like ghostly fingers. Thomas awoke disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling of his uncle's bedroom momentarily confusing him. The photograph from the previous night lay on his nightstand, the faces within it seemingly altered by the grey light, features slightly distorted, expressions more sinister. After dressing, Thomas made his way to the study, determined to begin sorting through his uncle's papers. The room was a testament to Edmund Blackwood's methodical nature. Leather-bound ledgers arranged by year, correspondence filed alphabetically, and various legal documents sealed with wax and ribbon. Thomas selected the most recent ledger and began to review the estate's finances. His uncle had been wealthy, but the accounts showed a steady decline over the past decade. More puzzling were the monthly entries labelled simply M, with substantial sums allocated beside them. "Your breakfast, sir." Thomas started at Margaret's voice. She stood in the doorway, a tray balanced in her hands, her uniform as crisp as it had been the previous day, the same soil staining the hem. "Thank you, Margaret." He hesitated, then added, "How long have you been employed at Blackwood Manor?" She placed the tray on a side table. "I've served the Blackwood family for many years, sir." "And you knew my uncle well?" "Very well, sir." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. Mr. Edmund had his peculiarities, but he was a fair employer. Thomas retrieved the photograph from his pocket. "This was taken in 1882. The maid in this picture. Would you like me to open the drapes, sir? It's rather dark in here," Margaret interrupted, moving toward the windows. "No, thank you. About this photograph. Mrs. Collins mentioned you might want to review the cellar inventory today. The estate has quite an impressive wine collection." Thomas frowned at her persistent deflection. "Perhaps later. I'm more interested in—" "As you wish, sir." Margaret curtsied and left the room, closing the door with a soft click that nonetheless seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Thomas returned to the ledger, but found his concentration broken. He decided to explore the manor instead, hoping to gain some insight into his uncle's life, and perhaps into the mysterious Margaret. The house was larger than it appeared from the outside, with corridors that branched unexpectedly and rooms that seemed designed to disorient. In what must have been a music room, Thomas found a pianoforte draped in a dustcloth. The keys yellowed with age. In the library, books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, many with broken spines and faded titles. It was in a small anteroom, adjacent to the library, that Thomas discovered the employee ledgers. Each volume contained records of staff hired and dismissed, their wages, and occasional notes on their performance. Thomas quickly located the most recent book and flipped through the pages. Mrs. Collins, hired 1879, still employed. Edwin Marsh, hired 1880, still employed. Various other names appeared and were crossed out, with reasons for dismissal noted: inadequate service, theft, unsuitable temperament. But there was no entry for Margaret. Thomas checked the previous ledger and the one before that. Staff had come and gone throughout the decades, but no Margaret was ever recorded. A board creaked in the hallway outside. Thomas looked up to see a shadow pass beneath the door, too quickly to belong to the elderly Mrs. Collins or the limping Edwin. "Margaret?" Thomas called, rising to his feet. No response came, but when he opened the door, he found a folded piece of paper on the floor. Inside was a pressed flower, a white lily browned with age, and a single line of elegant script. "Some names are written in different books." Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He returned to the anteroom and continued his search, pulling out older ledgers, dust tickling his nose and throat. In a volume dated 1880-1882, he finally found what he was seeking, a single entry, written in his uncle's hand but later struck through with such force that the pen had torn the paper. "Margaret Winters, hired January 3rd, 1882. Dismissed February 17th, 1882. Reason, deceased." The discovery of Margaret's entry left Thomas deeply unsettled. He spent the remainder of the morning searching through his uncle's correspondence for any mention of the maid's death, but found nothing. By noon, a headache had taken root behind his eyes, and he decided some fresh air might clear his thoughts. The fog had lifted, though dark clouds still hung low in the sky, promising rain. Thomas donned his coat and walked the grounds, his feet crunching on the gravel path that wound through the neglected gardens. The property extended farther than he had realized, with the manicured lawns near the house gradually giving way to wilder growth, and finally to a dense copse of trees that marked the estate's boundary. As Thomas approached the trees, he spotted Edwin, the groundskeeper, tending to what appeared to be a small garden. The old man looked up at Thomas's approach, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "Afternoon, Mr. Harrington," Edwin said, touching his cap. "Bit damp for a stroll?" "Just getting acquainted with the property," Thomas replied, noticing that the garden Edwin was tending consisted entirely of white lilies. "Those are beautiful flowers." Edwin's gnarled hands stilled. "They're for Miss Margaret. She was partial to lilies." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Was? Is," Edwin corrected quickly. "She is partial to them. My tongue gets ahead of my thoughts these days. Edwin, I found a record indicating that a Margaret Winters died here in 1882. The old man's face became as still as stone. "Don't know anything about that, sir. Before my time." "The ledger says you were hired in 1880. Edwin turned back to the lilies, his movements suddenly brusque. "Records can be mistaken. If you'll excuse me, sir, I have duties to attend to." Thomas was about to press further when he noticed a small structure beyond the lily garden. "What's that building there?" "Just the old chapel, sir, not used much these days." Thomas thanked Edwin and made his way toward the chapel. It was a simple stone building with a slate roof and a small bell tower. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior with several rows of pews facing a modest altar. The only light came from narrow windows of stained glass, casting colored patterns across the floor. At the back of the chapel was a door that led to a small cemetery. Most of the gravestones were old, their inscriptions worn by time and weather. Thomas walked among them, reading the names of Blackwoods long dead. In the farthest corner, partially obscured by overgrown ivy, he found a simple marker. "Margaret Winters, 1862-1882. Faithful servant." The earth before the grave seemed recently disturbed, with fresh soil darker than the surrounding ground. Thomas knelt to examine it and found a single white lily laid across the stone. The rain that had threatened all day finally began to fall, fat drops that quickly became a downpour. Thomas hurried back toward the house, the path now slick with mud. As he neared the manor, he glanced up at the windows and froze. In an upper room, clearly visible despite the rain and gathering darkness, stood Margaret. She was watching him, one hand pressed against the glass, her expression unreadable at this distance. Thomas raised a hand in uncertain greeting, and after a moment she returned the gesture. By the time Thomas entered the house, soaked and chilled, Margaret was waiting in the foyer with a towel. "You shouldn't wander so far from the house, sir," she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "It's easy to lose one's way on the grounds." "I found the chapel," Thomas said, watching her carefully, "and the cemetery." Margaret's expression didn't change, but she went very still. "The old cemetery hasn't been tended properly in years. Mrs. Collins says it's disrespectful." "I saw your grave, Margaret." She handed him the towel, her fingers brushing against his. They were ice cold. "You must be mistaken, sir. I'm standing right here. The gravestone says you died in 1882. The staff ledger confirms it." Margaret smiled then, a sad expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Yet here I am, serving tea and turning down beds. How strange." She turned to leave, then paused. "Your uncle asked the same questions when he first returned to the manor. He learned to stop asking eventually." "What happened to you?" Thomas called after her retreating figure. She looked back over her shoulder, and for a moment her form seemed to waver like a reflection in troubled water. "Dinner will be served at 7, Mr. Harrington. I suggest you change out of those wet clothes." As Margaret disappeared down the hallway, Thomas noticed dark footprints on the polished floor where she had stood. Not water from the rain, but soil, as if she had recently stood on freshly turned earth. That night, a storm raged outside Blackwood Manor. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the very foundations of the house. Thomas sat in the library, a fire crackling in the grate, as he examined a new discovery, his uncle's personal diary. He had found it hidden in a false bottom of Edmund's desk drawer, a slim volume bound in red leather. The entries began shortly after Edmund inherited the estate in 1882, following his father's death. March 12th, 1882. I have returned to Blackwood Manor as its master, a position I never sought nor desired. Father's passing was unexpected, despite his age. The house feels different now, colder somehow, and filled with whispers when I am alone. March 15th, 1882. The staff seems nervous around me, particularly when I inquire about the maid, Margaret. They claim no knowledge of her, yet I found her name in the ledger, struck through with the notation, "Deceased." When I pressed Mrs. Collins, she grew pale and excused herself. Something is not right in this house. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. His uncle's elegant script grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. April 3rd, 1882, I saw her today. Margaret, standing at the end of the east corridor, watching me. When I called out, she vanished. Am I going mad? Edwin tends a garden of lilies. For Miss Margaret, he says, then falls silent when questioned further. April 10th, 1882, found a hidden compartment in the library containing correspondence between father and a Dr. Whitmore regarding unusual occurrences at the manor, references to a sensitive girl with remarkable abilities. Could this be Margaret? As Thomas read on, a pattern emerged. His uncle had become obsessed with uncovering the truth about Margaret Winters, convinced that her presence in the house was no mere hallucination. Edmund described finding the same grave Thomas had discovered, with the same evidence of recent care. May 21st, 1882, visited the village today and inquired about the Winters family. The locals grew reticent, but the elderly shopkeeper finally admitted that a girl named Margaret had indeed served at Blackwood Manor. A quiet thing, he said, with a gift for knowing what others were thinking. He would say no more. The entries became more disturbing as Edmund delved deeper into Margaret's history. June 7th, 1882, Dr. Whitmore's journals revealed the terrible truth. Father discovered Margaret's unusual sensitivity and exploited it. She could somehow perceive events before they occurred, investments to make, business rivals to outmaneuver. The Blackwood fortune was built on her visions, and when she threatened to leave, a tremendous crash of thunder made Thomas jump. The lights flickered, then went out entirely, leaving only the fire's glow to illuminate the pages. June 8th, 1882. I now know what happened to Margaret Winters. Father could not allow her to leave, not with her knowledge of how the family fortune was truly amassed. She was imprisoned in the East Wing, forced to continue her predictions. And when she became ill that winter, the entry ended abruptly, as if Edmund had been interrupted. The next page had been torn out, leaving only a ragged edge. Thomas closed the diary, his mind racing. The East Wing had been closed off for decades, according to Mrs. Collins, ostensibly due to structural concerns. A soft knock came at the library door. It opened before Thomas could respond, revealing Margaret, a candelabra in her hand, the flames casting unsettling shadows across her face. "The storm has affected the electricity, sir," she said. "I've brought you light." "Thank you, Margaret." Thomas hesitated, then held up the diary. "I've been reading about you." She entered the room, placing the candelabra on the table beside him. "Have you found what you're looking for, Mr. Harrington?" "Not entirely. There are pages missing." Margaret smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. "Some stories are better left unfinished." "What happened to you, Margaret?" "What did my great-grandfather do?" "Your family has always been ambitious, sir." She moved to the window, looking out at the storm. "Old Mr. Blackwood discovered my sensitivity. Shortly after I entered service here, I could see things, futures that might be, choices and their consequences. He found it useful. He forced you to use this ability for financial gain. Force is such an ugly word. He provided incentives. Her voice hardened. And when incentives failed, there were other methods. And you died here, in 1882. Margaret turned to face him, and in the candlelight her features seemed to shift, becoming gaunt, her eyes sunken. I fell ill with fever. Your great-grandfather refused to summon a doctor, fearing I might reveal his secrets. I died in a small room in the East Wing, alone and burning with fever. Thomas felt a chill despite the fire's warmth. Why are you still here? The Blackwoods bound me to this house, she said simply. In life through threats and manipulation, in death through means I don't fully understand. Your uncle discovered certain books in your great-grandfather's collection, books of rituals that should not exist. That's impossible, is it? Margaret gestured toward the diary. Ask yourself why your uncle insisted the heir must stay for 3 months, why the Blackwood fortune always seems to recover just when financial ruin threatens. Who do you think has continued to provide those valuable insights? The candle flame suddenly bent, as if in a strong draught, though the air in the room was still. Margaret's form seemed to waver again, like a reflection in disturbed water. It's late, Mr. Harrington. You should rest. She moved toward the door, her steps silent on the carpeted floor. The East Wing key is in your uncle's desk. The missing pages of the diary are hidden behind the portrait in the room at the end of the corridor. Should you wish to understand the full extent of your inheritance, as she reached the doorway, she looked back at him one last time. But understand this, knowledge comes with responsibility. Your uncle learned that truth too late. The door closed behind her, leaving Thomas alone with the crackling fire and a decision to make. Morning brought clear skies and an unnatural stillness to Blackwood Manor. Thomas had slept fitfully, his dreams filled with corridors that led nowhere and a woman's voice calling his name from behind locked doors. He rose early, determined to investigate the East Wing before his courage failed him. The key was exactly where Margaret had said it would be, in a small lacquered box in his uncle's desk drawer. It was an ornate thing of tarnished silver, heavier than it looked, and cold to the touch. Thomas waited until after breakfast, when Mrs. Collins had retreated to the kitchen and Edwin was occupied in the gardens. The entrance to the East Wing was concealed behind a tapestry in the main corridor, the door beneath it sealed with a padlock that looked newer than its surroundings. The key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been recently oiled. The door opened onto a dark corridor, the air beyond stale and thick with dust. Thomas lit the oil lamp he had brought and stepped through the threshold. Unlike the rest of the manor, which had been maintained despite its gradual decline, the East Wing was frozen in time. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and the carpet underfoot was worn to threads in places. Doorways lined the corridor, each leading to rooms that might have once been guest quarters or servants' accommodations. Thomas checked each room systematically, finding little of interest until he reached the end of the corridor. The final door was different from the others, sturdier, with a small grille set into it at eye level. It wasn't locked. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished. A narrow bed, a washstand, a desk, and a chair. The single window was fitted with iron bars. Despite the decades of abandonment, the room felt recently occupied, with less dust than the corridor outside, and an impression in the thin mattress, as if someone had sat there not long ago. On the desk lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Thomas recognized the handwriting immediately, the same flowing script that had written the note about names in different books. It was Margaret's diary. January 4th, 1882. Mr. Blackwood has discovered my secret. I never should have confided in Mary about the visions. She must have told him, thinking it would please the master. Now he watches me constantly, asking questions about his investments, about people he plans to do business with. I am afraid. January 18th, 1882. He threatened to dismiss me without a character if I don't help him. With no reference, I'll never find another position. My family depends on my wages. What choice do I have? The entries documented Margaret's gradual imprisonment, first figuratively, as she was isolated from the other servants, and then literally as she was moved to the room in the East Wing for privacy. February 10th, 1882. The fever worsens. I begged Mr. Blackwood to send for a doctor, but he refuses. He says I'm merely being dramatic. Last night, in my delirium, I saw my own grave. I fear what it portends. The final entry was dated February 17th, 1882. I know I will not survive the night. The fever burns too hot, and my strength is gone. With my last moments I curse this house and the Blackwood name. They have taken everything from me, my freedom, my future, and now my life. I will never leave this place, not truly, and neither shall they escape what they have done. Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling. Above the desk hung a small, tarnished mirror. As he looked up, he caught a glimpse of movement reflected in the glass, not his own, but a figure standing behind him. He whirled around, but the room was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, Margaret's face stared back at him, her eyes hollow and her skin pale as parchment. "You found my prison," her voice whispered, though her lips didn't move. Thomas stumbled backward. "You're not real, and am I not?" The reflection smiled, a terrible thing with too many teeth. "I am as real as this house, as real as the fortune it has brought your family. What do you want from me?" "The same thing I wanted from your uncle, release." The image in the mirror shifted, showing Margaret as she must have looked in her final hours, gaunt and fevered. "He promised to set me free, but he lied. Just as his father lied. Just as you will lie." "I'm not like them," Thomas protested. "You are a Blackwood. The blood that flows in your veins is the same that imprisoned me, that let me die alone in this room." The mirror cracked suddenly, a jagged line splitting Margaret's reflection. "Find the missing pages, learn the truth, then decide if you are truly different." The mirror shattered, fragments tinkling to the floor. In the silence that followed, Thomas thought he heard soft weeping, though whether it came from within the room or from somewhere deeper in the house, he couldn't tell. He left the East Wing with Margaret's journal tucked inside his jacket, the weight of it a constant reminder of what had happened in this house, what his family had done. The portrait Margaret had mentioned hung in his uncle's bedroom, a stern-faced man whom Thomas recognized as his great-grandfather, Harrison Blackwood. Thomas removed it from the wall, finding a small compartment cut into the plaster behind it. Inside were the missing pages from Edmund's diary, along with a folded sheet of paper that proved to be a letter addressed to the next heir. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. Edmund's letter was dated just 3 days before his death. "To the next heir of Blackwood Manor. If you are reading this, then I have failed in my attempt to break the cycle that has bound our family for generations. I had hoped to be the last Blackwood to carry this burden, but fate, or perhaps Margaret, has decided otherwise. By now you will have encountered her. You will have discovered her history, her unjust imprisonment, and her death at the hands of my father. What you may not yet understand is that her presence here is not merely a haunting, but the result of a deliberate act, a ritual performed by my father in the days following her death. The missing pages from my diary, which you now hold, detail what I discovered in my father's private papers. Harrison Blackwood, facing financial ruin and desperate to maintain the advantage Margaret's visions had provided, turned to forbidden knowledge. He found a way to bind her spirit to this house, to continue exploiting her abilities even after death. The ritual required blood, Blackwood blood, and a promise that her service would end when the family line ended. My father, in his arrogance, believed this would never happen, that the Blackwood name would continue indefinitely. He did not foresee that I would remain childless, that you, a distant relation, would be the last of our line. For 40 years, I lived with the knowledge of what my father had done. I benefited from it, I'm ashamed to admit. Margaret's insights, communicated through dreams and whispers, guided my investments and protected the family fortune. I told myself I would find a way to release her, to undo what my father had done. I found the counter-ritual contained in the same ancient text my father had used. It requires the willing sacrifice of the last Blackwood, the voluntary surrender of the fortune built on Margaret's suffering. This I intended to do, but something prevented me. Call it cowardice, call it the influence of the house itself. But I could not complete the ritual. Now the burden falls to you. The choice is yours. Maintain the bargain as I did, growing wealthy on stolen futures, or end it at great personal cost. Choose wisely, and perhaps find the courage that I lacked. Edmund Blackwood. With the letter were the torn pages from Edmund's diary, detailing the ritual his great-grandfather had performed. A blasphemous ceremony conducted in the chapel at midnight, with Margaret's freshly buried body exhumed, and her hands bound with rope soaked in Harrison Blackwood's blood. Thomas felt ill. He set the papers aside and moved to the window, needing fresh air. In the garden below, he saw Edwin tending to the lilies. The old man looked up as if sensing Thomas's gaze and raised a hand in greeting. Thomas returned the gesture automatically, his mind still processing what he had learned. A soft knock came at the bedroom door. When Thomas opened it, he found Margaret standing in the corridor, a silver tea tray in her hands. "I thought you might need refreshment, sir," she said, her voice perfectly composed. "You've had a trying morning." Thomas stepped back to allow her entry, watching as she set the tray on a small table. "You knew what was in those papers?" "Yes." She straightened, smoothing her apron with pale hands. "I've known since your uncle found them. He promised to free me, but in the end, he couldn't bear to give up what my servitude provided. The Blackwood fortune." "The Blackwood fortune," she agreed, "built on my visions, maintained through my enslavement. Even now, I can see possibilities unfolding, investments that will yield returns, business ventures that will succeed or fail. Your uncle used this knowledge until his last day, and now you expect me to make the same choice he did." Thomas gestured to the letter on the bed, "to either continue exploiting you or to sacrifice everything." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "I expect nothing, Mr. Harrington. I have learned, over these long decades, not to hope for compassion from a Blackwood." "I'm not like them," Thomas said, echoing his words from the East Wing. "I have my own life, my own career. I don't need this house or its tainted wealth." "Don't you?" Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the grounds. "The ritual requires more than just renouncing the inheritance. It requires blood freely given and a life willingly sacrificed. Your uncle couldn't bring himself to complete it, can you?" Thomas joined her at the window. From this vantage point, he could see the chapel where the original ritual had been performed, the cemetery where Margaret's body lay, and the vast estate that had been built on her suffering. "What happens if I refuse? If I simply leave? Then another Blackwood will come eventually, a cousin perhaps, or a more distant relation. The house will wait. It has patience." Margaret turned to face him. "And I will remain, neither living nor truly dead, bound to this place and to your bloodline." Thomas thought of his life in Boston, comfortable but not extravagant, built on his own efforts rather than inherited privilege. He thought of what it would mean to walk away from Blackwood Manor, knowing what he now knew. "Show me," he said finally. "Show me what the ritual requires." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected this response. "Are you certain? I need to understand exactly what my uncle couldn't bring himself to do." She nodded slowly. "Tonight, then, when the house is quiet, I will show you." As she left the room, Thomas noticed something he hadn't before. Beneath the soil staining the hem of her uniform, the fabric was charred, as if it had been touched by fire. Darkness had claimed Blackwood Manor by the time Thomas made his way to the chapel. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the path was visible only by the light of his lantern. The air held the promise of rain, heavy with moisture and the scent of damp earth. Thomas had spent the remainder of the day in a state of increasing unease. Mrs. Collins had served dinner in silence, her eyes averted, as if she could sense what was coming. Edwin had not appeared at all. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, the usual creaks and settling noises absent. The chapel door stood open, candlelight flickering within. Thomas hesitated on the threshold, then stepped inside. Margaret waited at the altar, her uniform exchanged for a simple white dress that might have been fashionable 30 years earlier. Beside her on the altar lay an ancient book, its binding cracked and its pages yellowed. "You came," she said, her voice echoing in the small space. "I wasn't certain you would." "I said I would." Thomas approached, setting his lantern on a nearby pew. "Is that the book my great-grandfather used?" "Yes. Your uncle kept it hidden in the library behind works of natural philosophy that he knew no one would disturb." Margaret opened it to a page, marked with a ribbon. "The ritual is described here, along with its counter." Thomas examined the text, written in archaic language and accompanied by disturbing illustrations. The binding ritual his great-grandfather had performed was worse than he had imagined. Not merely blood and promises, but profane invocations and symbols carved into Margaret's flesh after death. "This is monstrous," he whispered. "Yes." Margaret's voice was flat. "Harrison Blackwood was a monstrous man, but it is the counter-ritual that concerns us now." Thomas turned the page and read the requirements for breaking the binding. It called for the last of the bloodline to willingly surrender what had been gained through the original sin, not merely the wealth but the life sustained by it. "A sacrifice," Thomas said, looking up at Margaret. "Not metaphorical but literal. Your uncle understood this part too late. He had already benefited from my enslavement for decades. The price had grown too high." Margaret's form flickered in the candlelight, momentarily revealing the gaunt, fevered woman she had been in her final hours. The house would not let him complete it. The house. Blackwood Manor is more than wood and stone now. It has absorbed the energies of the ritual of my prolonged existence between worlds. It has awareness. Margaret gestured to the windows, beyond which the manor was just visible on the hill. "It will try to stop you as it stopped Edmund." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "How did my uncle die?" "He came here, just as you have, with the intention of performing the counter-ritual. He brought a knife, his will, and what remained of his courage." Margaret's eyes grew distant. The house sensed his purpose. As he began the invocation, the candles went out. In the darkness, he heard footsteps, his father's footsteps, approaching the altar. What happened? His heart failed him, in both senses. Fear stopped his heart, and his courage deserted him in his final moments. Margaret's gaze returned to Thomas. "The knife he brought is still here, beneath the altar cloth." Thomas lifted the cloth to find an ornate dagger with a silver hilt. "And this is what's required, my blood and my life. Your willing sacrifice to atone for what your family has taken from me. Your life to purchase my freedom." Margaret's voice softened. "It is a terrible choice, Mr. Harrington. I would not blame you for walking away as your uncle ultimately did." Thomas picked up the dagger, feeling its weight. "And if I do this, if I complete the ritual, what happens to you?" "I will be released. Where my spirit goes afterward, I cannot say." A sad smile touched her lips. "Perhaps nowhere. Perhaps oblivion is all that awaits me. But it would be an end to this half-existence, and that alone would be mercy." Thunder rumbled in the distance as Thomas considered the dagger in his hand. The silver hilt was cool against his palm, engraved with symbols he didn't recognize, but instinctively found disturbing. "There must be another way," he said finally. "Some compromise that doesn't require death." Margaret shook her head, her form flickering again. "The ritual demands balance. A life was taken, mine. A life must be given in exchange, the last of the Blackwood line. The magic that binds me recognizes no half measures." Thomas placed the dagger on the altar. "Let me see the book again." He studied the ritual more carefully this time, noting details he had missed in his initial shock. The text spoke of the willing surrender of life sustained by transgression, and blood freely given to break bonds forged in blood. "It doesn't explicitly say death is required," Thomas said slowly. "Only the surrender of life sustained by the original sin." Margaret's expression remained skeptical. "How else would you interpret it? The Blackwood fortune, the life of luxury and privilege built on your suffering, that's what must be surrendered." Thomas felt a growing certainty. "Not my physical life, but the life I would lead as master of Blackwood Manor. Your uncle tried such interpretations. He donated to charities, renounced portions of his inheritance. It wasn't enough, because he had already benefited from your enslavement for decades. I haven't." Thomas turned to face her fully. "I've been here less than a week. I've touched nothing of the Blackwood fortune. What if that makes a difference?" A sudden gust of wind rattled the chapel windows. The candles flickered, but didn't go out. "The house is listening," Margaret whispered. "It senses your thoughts." As if in confirmation, the chapel door slammed shut. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. "We need to act quickly," Thomas said, picking up the dagger again, "before it tries to stop us." He cut his palm with the blade, letting blood well up and drip onto the open book. "I, Thomas Harrington, last of the Blackwood line, renounce all claims to the estate and fortune built on Margaret Winter's suffering. I surrender freely what was taken by force." The blood on the page began to move, forming symbols that matched those in the book. The candlelight took on a reddish hue. "It's not enough," Margaret said, her voice strained. "The house resists." Outside, the wind rose to a howl. Something heavy struck the chapel roof, a fallen branch perhaps, or something the house had thrown in its rage. Thomas continued, raising his voice over the storm. "I pledge to dismantle the Blackwood fortune, to use every penny to honor Margaret Winter's memory and to atone for the crimes committed against her." The chapel began to shake, dust and small fragments of stone raining down from the ceiling. A stained glass window shattered, sending colored shards across the floor. "The house fights you," Margaret said, her form becoming more solid, even as the chapel seemed to dissolve around them. "It will not surrender easily what it has held for so long." Thomas felt a presence pushing against his mind. Alien thoughts, not his own, urging him to flee, to abandon this foolishness, to embrace his inheritance and the power it would bring. He gritted his teeth against the intrusion. "I reject the Blackwood legacy in its entirety," he shouted over the cacophony. "I break the chain that has bound Margaret Winters to this house and to my family. With my blood and my oath, I set her free." He pressed his bleeding hand to the page where the counter-ritual was described. The blood spread across the text, obliterating the words and symbols. For a moment nothing happened. Then Margaret gasped, her eyes widening. Her form shimmered, the edges of her becoming indistinct. "Something is happening," she whispered. "I feel different." A crack appeared in the chapel floor, running from the altar to the door. The walls groaned as if under immense pressure. In the distance, from the direction of the manor, came the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. "The house," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. "It's losing its hold." Thomas staggered as the floor shifted beneath him. "We need to get out of here. The chapel is collapsing." "No," Margaret said, reaching for his hand. Her touch was warm now, no longer the ice-cold sensation he had felt before. "Stay with me, please. It's almost done." The roof above them began to cave in, but the debris seemed to pass through Margaret's form without touching her. Thomas crouched beside the altar as more of the ceiling came down around them. "Thomas," Margaret said, using his given name for the first time. "Thank you." Her form was changing now, the servant's dress fading, replaced by a simple white gown. The soil stains and burns disappeared. Her face, too, was transforming, the gauntness receding, color returning to her cheeks, her eyes bright with an emotion Thomas couldn't name. "You're free," he said, understanding what he was witnessing. "Yes." Her voice was fading, though her form grew more distinct. "And so are you." With a final deafening crack, the chapel roof collapsed entirely. Thomas threw himself beneath the sturdy oak altar as stone and timber crashed down around him. Dust filled the air, choking him, and for several minutes he could do nothing but cover his head and wait for the destruction to end. When silence finally fell, broken only by the settling of debris and the distant rumble of thunder, Thomas emerged from his shelter. The chapel was in ruins, open to the night sky. Rain began to fall, washing away the dust and mingling with the blood on his hand. Of Margaret there was no sign. Dawn broke over a transformed Blackwood estate. The manor house, which had stood for over a century, was now little more than a shell, windows shattered, portions of the roof collapsed, the east wing entirely gone as if it had never existed. The grounds, too, had changed overnight. Gardens overgrown with weeds, paths obscured, the lily garden Edwin had tended now a wild tangle of vegetation. Thomas sat on a fallen column from the chapel, watching as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the destruction. His hand was bandaged with a strip torn from his shirt, the cut stinging but not deep enough to cause concern. He was exhausted but strangely at peace. "Mr. Harrington," Mrs. Collins approached, picking her way through the debris. She looked older this morning, her face more lined, but her back straighter, as if a burden had been lifted. "You're alive." "Yes," Thomas agreed, somewhat surprised by this fact himself. "Are you and Edwin unharmed?" "We are. We were in the gatehouse when whatever happened, happened." She surveyed the ruins around them. "The house is gone." "Yes." "And Miss Margaret?" Thomas looked up at her. "You knew all this time?" Mrs. Collins nodded slowly. "We all knew. We were bound to the house just as she was, though in different ways. Your uncle tried to free her, you know, he truly did. But the house wouldn't let him," Thomas finished. "But it's gone now, and Margaret is free." "Free," Mrs. Collins repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes, I believe she is." She straightened her apron, a habitual gesture that seemed oddly incongruous amidst the destruction. "What will you do now, Mr. Harrington?" It was a question Thomas had been pondering as he watched the sunrise. The Blackwood fortune, what remained of it, was still his bylaw along with the ruined estate. His promise to use it to honor Margaret's memory had been more than mere words to complete the ritual. It had been a genuine oath. "I'll sell the land," he said finally. "Most of it, at least. The house can't be rebuilt, nor should it be. The grounds will be donated to the village as a public park, perhaps, with a proper memorial for Margaret. And the money? A foundation," Thomas decided, "to assist young women seeking education and independence. Margaret was trapped by her circumstances as much as by my great-grandfather's cruelty. Others shouldn't suffer the same fate." Mrs. Collins nodded approvingly. "A fitting memorial. And yourself? Will you return to Boston?" Thomas considered the question. His life there seemed distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. The events of the past week had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Eventually, perhaps. But first, there's much to do here. He stood, wincing as stiff muscles protested. "The foundation will need establishing, the land transfers arranged, and I want to ensure that Margaret's story is properly documented, not hidden away, as my family tried to do." "The noble undertaking," said a voice behind them. Edwin approached, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Like Mrs. Collins, he appeared simultaneously older and unburdened. "She deserves to be remembered." "She does," Thomas agreed. "Will you help me? Both of you? You knew her in life, however briefly. Your recollections would be invaluable." The two elderly servants exchanged glances. "We will," Edwin said. "It's the least we can do." As they spoke, Thomas noticed something emerging from the tangled vegetation where Edwin's lily garden had been. A single white lily, perfect and untouched by the devastation around it, swaying gently in the morning breeze. "Look," he said quietly, pointing. Edwin smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "She always did favor lilies." In that moment, Thomas felt a presence, not the oppressive weight of the house's malevolence, but something lighter, a gentle acknowledgement, a farewell. "Goodbye, Margaret," he whispered, too softly for the others to hear. The lily bent in a sudden gust of wind, as if bowing in response. 6 months passed. The ruins of Blackwood Manor had been cleared away, the land reclaimed by nature with surprising speed, as if eager to erase all traces of what had stood there. Only the chapel foundations remained, preserved at Thomas's insistence as a reminder of what had occurred. Thomas had not returned to Boston. Instead, he had taken up residence in the village, renting rooms above the local bookshop while he oversaw the establishment of the Margaret Winters Foundation. The legal work had been complex, transferring the Blackwood assets, establishing the foundation's charter, arranging for the donation of the land. But Thomas had found the process satisfying in a way his previous work had never been. Today, he was meeting with the Village Historical Society in the small museum that occupied what had once been the town hall. Mrs. Collins and Edwin had contributed their memories of Margaret, and Thomas had provided the journals and papers he had rescued from the manor before its collapse. Now, the society was preparing an exhibition about the Blackwood estate and its most unfortunate servant. Mr. Harrington, the society's president, a retired schoolteacher named Miss Abernathy, greeted him. "We've made a most extraordinary discovery. I believe you'll want to see this immediately." She led him to a table where several documents were laid out, old photographs, letters, and a leather-bound journal Thomas didn't recognize. "These were donated yesterday by Mr. Whitmore, Dr. Whitmore's grandson," Miss Abernathy explained. "He found them in his attic while preparing to sell his family home." Thomas examined the photographs first. Most showed Blackwood Manor in its prime, with well-tended gardens and smartly dressed figures posed on the front steps. In one, he recognized his great-grandfather, standing beside a young woman who could only be Margaret. She was smiling, though her eyes held a wariness that was evident even in the faded image. "The journal is the most significant find," Miss Abernathy continued, opening it carefully. "It belonged to Dr. Whitmore, who was apparently consulted when Margaret first displayed her unusual abilities." Thomas leaned closer, reading the neat handwriting. "March 3rd, 1881. Harrison Blackwood has requested my professional opinion regarding one of his servants, a young woman named Margaret Winters. He claims she has demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict future events. I am skeptical, naturally, but have agreed to observe her. March 10th, 1881. I have met with the girl. She is intelligent, well-spoken for her station, and decidedly uncomfortable with Mr. Blackwood's interest in her abilities. When pressed, she demonstrated what she calls her knowing, correctly identifying details about my private life that she could not possibly have learned through conventional means. Most disturbing." The entries continued, documenting Dr. Whitmore's growing concern as Harrison Blackwood's obsession with Margaret's abilities intensified. The doctor had initially been fascinated from a scientific perspective, but became increasingly troubled by the ethical implications. June 15th, 1881. I have expressed my concerns to Mr. Blackwood regarding his treatment of the girl. He dismissed them, stating that she is merely a servant and that her gift belongs to him as her employer. I fear for her well-being, but am uncertain how to proceed. The final entries were the most revelatory. February 16th, 1882. Received urgent message from Edwin at Blackwood Manor. Margaret is gravely ill with fever, but Harrison refuses to allow me to attend her. I intend to go regardless. This has gone too far. February 17th, 1882. I arrived too late. The girl was dead when I reached the manor. Harrison claimed she had only just passed, but the condition of the body suggested otherwise. I suspect she had been dead for hours before I was summoned. I have documented my findings and my suspicions. Should anything happen to me, this journal will serve as testimony. February 20th, 1882. Harrison Blackwood visited me today, asking about certain texts in my library, specifically those dealing with old folk practices and superstitions. I denied having such materials, but his questions disturbed me greatly. What is he planning? February 25th, 1882. God help us all. I observed lights in the chapel at Blackwood Manor last night. This morning the grave in the cemetery had been disturbed. I fear Harrison has done something unspeakable. I have written to his son, Edmund, in London. The boy should know what his father has become. Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. This confirms everything. Margaret's abilities, her illness, my great-grandfather's refusal to seek proper medical attention. And Dr. Whitmore suspected the ritual, even if he didn't understand its nature. "There's more," Miss Abernathy said, handing him a yellowed envelope. This was found with the journal, still sealed. The envelope was addressed simply, "To Margaret Winter's family." Inside was a letter written in Dr. Whitmore's hand, dated March 1st, 1882. "To the family of Margaret Winters. It is with profound regret that I write to inform you of your daughter's passing on February 17th at Blackwood Manor. While Mr. Blackwood has likely provided an account of her death, I feel compelled by conscience to offer a more complete explanation. Margaret died of a fever that, had proper medical attention been sought in time, might not have proven fatal. Mr. Blackwood, for reasons I cannot fathom, delayed in sending for me until it was too late. I have reason to believe she suffered unnecessarily in her final hours. Furthermore, I must inform you of disturbing events following her death. Evidence suggests that Mr. Blackwood has engaged in practices that violate both the laws of God and man regarding the treatment of your daughter's remains. I've reported my concerns to the authorities, but given Mr. Blackwood's standing in the community, I hold little hope for justice through official channels. I enclose a sum that, while it cannot compensate for your loss, may assist you in these difficult times. It represents my personal penance for not having acted more decisively to protect Margaret while she lived. With deepest sympathies, Dr. James Whitmore." "The letter was never sent," Miss Abernathy explained. "Mr. Whitmore found a notation in his grandfather's personal calendar indicating that he learned the Winters family had moved away from their last known address. With no forwarding information, he apparently kept the letter, perhaps intending to deliver it personally if he ever located them." Thomas read the letter again, struck by the doctor's evident remorse and his unsuccessful attempt to bring Harrison Blackwood to justice. Did Dr. Whitmore ever speak out publicly about his suspicions? Not that we've found. According to local records, he left the village rather suddenly in April 1882. He relocated to Boston, in fact. Miss Abernathy adjusted her spectacles. "One wonders if he feared for his own safety, or if he was forced to leave," Thomas mused. "My great-grandfather would have had the influence to make his life uncomfortable, at the very least." "Indeed." Miss Abernathy gathered the documents carefully. "We'd like to include these in the exhibition, with your approval. They provide crucial context for Margaret's story." "Of course. The truth should be known, however uncomfortable." Thomas hesitated, then asked, "Has anyone been able to trace Margaret's family?" "I've had investigators searching, but with no success." "Not yet. The Winters name was not uncommon, and without knowing where they relocated," she shrugged apologetically, "but we'll continue looking. Someone, somewhere, must remember her." And as Thomas left the museum, the afternoon sun was warm on his face. A perfect spring day, with flowers blooming in window boxes and birds singing in the trees that lined the village streets. It was difficult to reconcile this peaceful scene with the darkness that had enveloped Blackwood Manor for so many decades. Yet the darkness was gone now, dispelled by truth and atonement. Margaret was free, her story no longer hidden, and Thomas, though still bound by his promise to honor her memory, felt free as well, liberated from a legacy of cruelty and exploitation he had never chosen. As he walked toward the bookshop, he passed the village church. In the small garden beside it, white lilies were blooming, their petals catching the sunlight. Thomas paused, watching them sway in the gentle breeze. "Rest well, Margaret," he murmured. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he heard a woman's voice on the wind, whisper back, "Thank you." 10 years had transformed both the former Blackwood estate and Thomas Harrington. The land where the manor had stood was now a public park, with winding paths, flower gardens, and a small lake that reflected the changing seasons. At its centre stood a modest memorial, a statue of a young woman in period dress, her expression serene, one hand extended as if offering something invisible to those who visited. The plaque beneath it read simply, "In memory of Margaret Winters, 1862-1882, her story will not be forgotten." Thomas, now in his early 40s, walked these paths regularly. His hair had begun to grey at the temples, and fine lines had appeared around his eyes, signs of a decade spent building something meaningful from the ashes of his family's dark legacy. The Margaret Winters Foundation had flourished beyond his initial expectations. What had begun as a small local initiative now provided scholarships and support to young women throughout New England, enabling them to pursue education and independence that would have been unimaginable to a Maid in 1882. Today was February 17th, the anniversary of Margaret's death, and in a sense, of her second liberation. Thomas carried a bouquet of white lilies as he made his way to the memorial, a yearly ritual he had maintained since the statue's installation. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," called a voice from nearby. Jane Wilson, the Foundation's current director, approached along the path. In her mid-20s, she was one of the Foundation's earliest beneficiaries, a brilliant young woman from limited circumstances who had gone on to earn degrees in both history and business. "I thought I might find you here today." "Jane," Thomas smiled, genuinely pleased to see her. "I didn't realize you were back from Boston. Just returned yesterday. The board meeting isn't until tomorrow, but I wanted to pay my respects today." She held up her own small bouquet of lilies. "Great minds, it seems." They walked together to the memorial, placing their flowers at the statue's base, where others had already left similar tributes. Over the years, Margaret's story had become well known in the region, inspiring not only the Foundation's work, but also a renewed interest in addressing historical injustices. "I have news," Jane said, as they sat on a nearby bench. "We've finally had a breakthrough in the search for Margaret's family." Thomas straightened, his interest immediately piqued. Despite a decade of searching, attempts to locate Margaret's descendants had been unsuccessful. "What have you found?" "A great-niece living in Chicago. Her grandmother was Margaret's younger sister, who was just a child when Margaret went into service at Blackwood Manor." Jane opened her briefcase and removed a folder. "Her name is Eleanor Winters. She never married, so she still carries the family name. She's 73, a retired librarian. Does she know about Margaret? About what happened?" "Only fragments. Family stories about an older aunt who died while working for a wealthy family in Massachusetts. The details were lost over the generations, or perhaps deliberately not passed down." Jane handed him a photograph. "But she has this." The photograph showed a young woman who was unmistakably Margaret, though happier and more carefree than in any of the images from Blackwood Manor. She stood in a garden, laughing at something outside the frame, her whole being radiating a vitality that Thomas had never associated with the spectral presence he had encountered. "She was beautiful," he said softly, "truly alive. Ms. Winters has agreed to visit next month. She's eager to learn the full story and to see the memorial." Jane hesitated. "I told her you would be willing to meet with her, to share what you know. I hope that's acceptable." "Of course." Thomas returned the photograph carefully. "It's important that her family knows the truth, all of it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as other visitors strolled through the park. Some stopped at the memorial, reading the plaque or leaving flowers of their own. Others simply enjoyed the peaceful surroundings, unaware of the darkness that had once permeated this land. "Sometimes I wonder," Thomas said eventually, "if she knows what's become of this place. If she can see how her story has helped others." Jane considered this. "I'm not particularly superstitious, as you know, but sometimes When I'm working late at the foundation offices, I feel as if I'm not alone. Not in a frightening way, but as if someone is watching over the work, approving of it. Thomas nodded, understanding completely. He had experienced similar moments over the years, a fleeting presence, a sense of something just beyond perception. Not a haunting, but a benevolent awareness. "The house bound her through cruelty," he said. "Perhaps she has chosen to remain connected to what we've built in her name, but through compassion instead." As the sun climbed higher, they rose to continue their separate days, Jane to prepare for the board meeting, Thomas to his own responsibilities. The foundation had become his life's work, a purpose that had given meaning to the inherited wealth he had once viewed with suspicion. Before leaving, Thomas paused for one last look at the memorial. The statue captured something of Margaret's essence. Not the pale, soil-stained spectre he had first encountered, but the young woman she had been and might have remained, had fate been kinder. In the clear light of day, with the statue casting its shadow across the flowers at its base, Thomas thought he saw something move at the edge of his vision, a figure in white, watching from beneath a distant tree. When he turned to look directly, there was nothing there, only dappled sunlight through the branches. But the breeze that touched his face carried the faint scent of lilies, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt the gentle pressure of a hand on his shoulder, warm, not cold, and filled with a gratitude that needed no words. "You're welcome," Thomas whispered to the empty air. "Always." As he walked away, leaving the past behind yet carrying its lessons forward, Thomas Harrington knew that some bonds transcended death and time, not the cruel chains of ritual and exploitation, but the enduring connections forged through understanding, atonement, and the simple, powerful act of remembering. In Blackwood Park, the lilies continued to bloom, season after season, year after year, a living memorial to a maid whose name had once existed in no record at all, but whose legacy now touched countless lives, flowering in ways she could never have imagined, but might, perhaps, still witness from whatever peace she had finally found.